story of the first Jews who came to Savannah, Georgia in 1733. And there weren't even any good kosher restaurants then. So, to come to. And and so it's a remarkable story that has roots that go back hundreds of years into Europe. And so that's what I want to share with you tonight. I'm hoping my cat, who's upstairs, who's now very talkative, doesn't come down here. He may interrupt us, but you'll have to forgive me. Here he's coming. Hold on a second. So I'm going to share my screen with you, if I could. Hello, Rafi. I hear you. Yep. Okay. You all can see that probably. It looks like it's got just a few little lines on it. So a number of years ago, our let's see if I can do this here. Oop, oop, let's see. Yeah. Okay, there we go. A number of years ago, our executive producer, a man named Lance Toland, was walking in Savannah, Georgia, and he came across this monument with James Edward Oglethorpe's name on it. Um, and and what's really odd about this, James Oglethorpe is not Jewish. He's known as the father of Georgia, and there's a Jewish menorah on it. And this is at the corner of Oglethorpe, where it's actually on an island between on the two ways of traffic on Oglethorpe Avenue at the corner of Bull Avenue. This is right at the heart of Old Savannah. And he was kind of like perplexed about this. And as you can see, a lot of people have put stones on top of this monument as though it's a graveyard, which in fact it is. And so this is the backside, and most people don't even walk around to the backside of this monument. And here it talks about 16 people who've been verified to have been buried right here at this intersection. And among them are some of the early settlers who came in 1733. I can give you a better view of the other panel. So what I want to do this evening is give you a short history of how early Jewish settlers helped to found and save the Georgia colony. And what I would like to encourage you as I go along, if you got questions, if we're a small enough group, stop me and we'll talk about it because we're going to go back. We're going to go back in time. Could you hear the music on that?
No.
No. You know what? Let me stop sharing because I may not have chosen. I may not have chosen share
Share
sound.
com
That's why I
share
did it.
computer. Yeah.
Right. Optimized for video sharing. Great. Okay. Great. So let me share again here. There we go. All right. So let's go back in time, and to do that, we have to go from today and go back centuries, and we're going to look at some of these specific
What's
dates.
that noise?
That's a clock ticking.
Oh,
We're going to go back to
sorry.
1190, and in 1190 in York, England, which is actually there's an intersection between York, England, and our story. There was a massacre of Jews at Clifford's Castle. And so this goes back to the early anti-Semitism that was very prevalent throughout Europe, but as well as in England. And the Jews came to England after 1066 in the Norman Conquest. Those were the first Jews who came to England, and they actually came because they could lend money, and that was the reason for allowing them in. And excuse me for a second. Yes, Rafi, I hear you. Sorry about the cat. He'll stop in a moment. Okay. Okay, that's enough. Thank you. All right. You would
So we
think that
can't hear him.
you can't hear him. Okay, good.
No,
Okay,
we
good.
can't hear him.
So the Jews came there, and around 1190, a couple of Jews went to the coronation of Richard the First in 1189, just the year before, and there had been great resentment about the presence of Jews in England. A lot of people owed them money, okay, and then they were getting taxed more to fund the Crusades, and and this led to actual riots at the ceremony for the coronation of Richard I. And a false rumor was began to spread that the king had ordered a massacre of the Jews, and it turns out a couple of the Jews who came to the coronation, one of them was attacked and killed on his way back to York. Some months later, the sheriff of York had left for the Third Crusade, and a fire broke out in the city, and there were increasing attacks on the Jews during that time, and they blamed the Jews for it, of course, and basically the Christians in the community decided that they had full license to go after and attack all the Jews. The Jews ended up fleeing into Clifford's castle, and there was a sheriff there for protection. And they had a falling out with him in some way, and he departed. And both soldiers and the rest of the community gathered around the castle, and they were calling for their death. And in Masada fashion, the Jews decided it would be better to take their own lives rather than go down. And the castle caught fire, and all the Jews killed the husbands killed all their families. A few Jews who had been promised that if they came out, they would be given protection were immediately slaughtered by the crowd. And so that is a kind of a beginning point in England, and England becomes an important part of our story. And we fast forward to 1290, and Edward I expelled the Jews in a deal with Parliament so that he could do a tax of 116 pounds to fund some of his projects as well as the Crusades. And so there was an edict of expulsion, and the Jews departed from England, and they did not come back until around 1560. We'll get to that date in a moment. Meanwhile, in Spain, our lovely Spain, and we get into the Sepharad story, which we talked about a little last week, there was beginning to develop hatred against the Jews. There was the golden period in which Jews and the Moors, the Arabs, and the Christians got along for a period of time, but that had passed. And in the Stella Lizara, up in the north part of Spain, there were terrible riots against the Jews, and many were killed. The Jewish quarter was destroyed, and most of the inhabitants. Then the French invaded, and most of the inhabitants died. Soon after that, Jewish communities. Okay, we've already talked about that. And then in Toledo, which is in the center of the country, there was a lovely guy named Henry Trastamara, he was a half brother of the King Pedro, and King Pedro had embraced the Jews, and Trastamara was opposed to it, and he invaded a section of the Jewish quarter of Toledo, attacked and murdered thousands of people in Toledo in 1355. So being a Jew in Spain was becoming less and less tenable.
Rick, can I interrupt for a moment?
Yeah.
I just want to come back to my main window here. Which is it's not a question, but rather a acknowledging the elephant in the room here, which is, of course, that our history is repeating itself all over again now.
Yeah.
And these are very, very painful times that we are living in. And tomorrow is going to be a very painful and difficult day for many of us, and certainly for all of Israel. So I can't tell you how to receive this information from Rick. But I do. I know for myself that I need to do a little bit of self-care as as you're sharing this, Rick, with us, as the background for your this important work that you've done. So I just want to encourage each of us to do what is necessary to do to take care of ourselves as during the Rick's presentation, given the elephant in the room.
Yeah, thank you for that,
Thanks.
Mark. And yeah, this is really, you start to get into the history of what happened in Spain. Um, it is deeply disturbing, but we begin to see that this is just a pattern that's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Um, and it continued on in Seville, in the south. Um, and there was an archdeacon, Ferran Martinez. He argued that synagogues were havens for the devil, and he called upon the clergy to destroy the synagogues, and he wanted all the books and Torah's scrolls sent to him. He was quite a character, and then there was terrible violence in Seville that followed that. And this was the beginning of many of the forced conversions in 1391. This is a full 100 years prior to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and in which they were given a choice to either convert or leave. But the conversions really began 100 years before that. And many did, and they became what was known as conversos. And but many continued, obviously, to practice Judaism. They didn't move out of the Jewish quarter. They didn't move away from their neighbors. And so you had conversos living among Jews, and many of them secretly kept practicing Judaism. And then we find just soon after that, King Charles VI expelled, there were only about 100,000 Jews in France at the time. He had a declaration in which he expelled them. And then in 1412, in Portugal, Jews were prohibited by the King John II, from practicing medicine and most other economic activity. They were ordered to isolate themselves in designated Jewish quarters. So this was the beginning of this practice of basically making their life untenable. In 1415, Pope Benedict issued an edict prohibiting Jews and conversos from studying the Talmud or building new synagogues or even restoring the old ones. So there was an attempt, really an organized attempt by the Catholic Church to do everything they could to basically suppress the Jewish faith and the Jewish communities. And obviously they didn't succeed at it. And part of what was also happening here is that many of the Jews who had converted, the Catholic Church knew that they were secretly practicing Judaism. And this was a problem for the church, because now they had people who were outwardly Catholic, but they knew that they were not being true to the faith. And the church was deeply disturbed by this. And the Inquisition was really a response to that. Ciudad Real, the Archbishop of Toledo, concluded that the conversos were all covert Judaizers. So this, they began to kind of recognize that they were actually they were Judaizing. And then in Caesarea, you have King Ferdinand ordered the segregation of the Jews in Syria and Caesarea in 1477. The Pope gives his first authority to the Spanish monarchs to appoint inquisitors. So this was the beginning of saying, how do we root out this problem? Is that we have Jews, we have Catholics who are not really true to the faith, and they were demanding purity of faith. And then we have 1492, where the Jews are expelled from Spain. And we had in our research, and then in our part of the podcast, we did a number of interviews as well as the dramatic podcast. One of those people was Eleazar Papo, who was a expert in Sepharad and Spanish literature from this era. And he equated the expulsion in 1492 to the Babylonian expulsion, the Babylonian enslavement. This was Spain had become the heart of the Jewish world at this point, and the Jews being pushed out of Spain turned out to be just a catastrophe for our people. So if you did not convert, you often were killed, and they would often take their children for parents who refused to convert. And then something happened in Lisbon in 1497, which is pivotal to our story. So thousands of Jews obviously went eastward toward the Ottoman Empire and settled along the Mediterranean coast and in what's now Turkey. About 30,000 Jews went westward to Portugal, which accepted them and was glad to have them come with their wealth and with their expertise. And the king at that point in 1492 saw it as a boon. But in 1497, he wanted his son to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel, who had now unified Spain. And they had one condition, and that condition was that there be no Jews left in Portugal. So that was a quandary, what to do. And so he promised the Jews if they came to Lisbon that he would arrange for free passage for all those who chose to leave. And there would be boats there to take them. But when they arrived, they were told that there were no boats. And they had a choice, either convert or die. And so in one day, 30,000 Jews converted to Catholicism in one day. And, you can imagine that the conversions were quick and dirty. There was probably a little water was sprinkled, a short prayer was said, and they were pushed out. And we tell a little bit of this story in our dramatic series. And the people who have become central figures in the Flames of Freedom story can trace their lineage all the way back to this event. So by the time we pick up the story in early 1700, we're probably 7 or 8 generations removed from these Jews who had converted and had lived then for generations in Portugal as Catholics, but most of them or many of them continue to secretly practice Judaism. But as you would imagine, they didn't have access to prayer books. They didn't know Hebrew. So actually, Spanish became the language of prayer. It was seen as the language of prayer. And these people, in whatever way they could, they tried to maintain some rituals. So there are certain kind of holidays that became very important. Obviously, Hanukkah became one of those. And the story of Esther, interestingly, turned out to be a very powerful story for them because it was a story about Esther was in hiding. No one knew that she was a Jewess. And the Jews ended up having their revenge against Haman and all of his followers. And so that holiday also became an important one for the conversos who privately practiced. But what happened was conversos found all kinds of workarounds. So many of them, for example, would put a small statue of Mary by the front door, and they would put a mezuzah inside of it. So it would reach down and kiss Mother Mary, knowing that the mezuzah was inside. If it was Yom Kippur and they were not eating, they would go out and they would make like they just had a full meal and they would be wiping their mouth, And so they would do everything they could to create the semblance that they were not practicing Jews, but obviously the church suspected them. And what they would do is the Inquisition would arrest you, and you were guilty until proven innocent. So they would torture you until you admitted that you had been Judaizing, and it became a wonderful vehicle for the church and the state to confiscate the belongings of these people. And then they would have their hands slapped, and in most cases they were released. In the more extreme cases, the heretics were burned at the stake, those who refused to admit that they had been Judaizing or who defied the church. And there would be events that were called auto da fes, which is auto da fe means act of faith. And they would they would have, it was a spectacle. They would build seating all in the large town square. Those Jews who were getting their hands slapped would have to wear these things called sanbenitos. It was like sackcloth that would have symbols on it that would show that they had been unfaithful to the church, and they would be paraded around and humiliated in the community, and then they would have to rebuild their life. And this is the case in our story. Well, before we get to that, let's talk about England in 1656. And let me get to my notes on this. Hold on one second. Yeah, right there. In 1656, Manasseh ben Israel, who was a rabbi in Amsterdam, comes to England and gets an audience with Cromwell and makes a request to allow Jews to return to England. And this is debated in the parliament to some degree. There was never any formal declaration that the Jews could come, but there was a tacit understanding that it was okay. And Jews began to come back into England, but they didn't actually have full recognition or full rights. And this would not come until the mid 1800s, before Parliament finally passed some kind of an act that would do that. And what's interesting, after Cromwell was killed, and the son of James, who had been run out of England and during the Civil War, came back to England to take over. Cromwell was they exhumed Cromwell's body and cut off his head and quartered him and left him to rot in the town square. They hated Cromwell so much but the good news was, because if they had passed something to allow the Jews to stay, this James II, I think it was, would have probably revoked it just in spite, because anything that Cromwell had touched, he wanted to reverse. So luckily, they had not passed anything in Parliament, so the Jews were allowed to stay, but their status was never fully confirmed until almost a good 150 years later. Our story picks up in Lisbon in 1703, and Diogo and Gracia Nunes Ribeiro. Diogo is a physician and respected in the community, and he and his wife, they have one child, and they're arrested for Judaizing, and they're incarcerated for over 2 years. And Diogo quickly confessed, but Gracia was much more, she was a tough cookie, and it took a lot more before she finally agreed to sign off. And in our research, what's interesting is, as we were researching the story, we were able, the Portuguese were amazing, and the Catholic Church was amazing. They had notaries there to take down confessions during all of the interrogations in the jails, and all those interrogation notes are available in the archives. And we were actually able to get the actual interrogations of Diogo and Gracia, get them translated from Portuguese to English, and they informed some of our writing on the show. And so Gracia, she was tortured and finally gave in. Now, something was happening in England around this time, which was very interesting. There's a man named John Toland. And what's interesting is our executive producer's name is Lance Toland, and Lance is certain that he is related to John Toland in some way. And his story is another, if we have time, maybe later I can tell you some of his story. John Toland was a philosopher. He was actually Irish. And he had written, his first book was essentially an attack on the Catholic Church. And he, of course, he wrote it while he was in England. They wanted to burn him at the stake in Ireland. They convicted him in absentia. And so since they couldn't burn him, they burned his books. So there was a whole change of thinking about the Trinity, and for example, the Unitarian Unitarians were coming. They actually came out of this period in England, and he wrote a book that was really for its time remarkable. It's called Reasons for Naturalizing the Jews in Great Britain and Ireland. And he basically said, why are we persecuting Jews? Does this make any sense? Where does this come from? And we believe that actually Oglethorpe, James Oglethorpe, was at Oxford at the time. And we have a suspicion that Oglethorpe was exposed to Toland's ideas. So there was this new idea that Jews should be treated like all other people. And Toland was really a revolutionary in that regard. In 1706, they're released. And then in 1726, they're re-arrested. And between 1706 and 1726, there is nothing in the historical record really to help us. But we do know that by 1726, that Diogo Nunes Ribeiro had rebuilt his life, and he was known as a brilliant diagnostician as a doctor. And miracle of miracles, he had become the physician to the Inquisitor General in a great ironic move, and probably also to the King of Portugal and other people in the royal court. People were coming to him for his help. And but it turns out that he had been secretly helping other conversos depart. He was running basically an underground railroad to help conversos get out of Portugal to England. And so somebody lodged a complaint, and he and his family are arrested again. And they begin to torture his daughter in front of them. And Diogo says, "Stop! I'll confess to anything." And they take him to the Inquisitor General. And the Inquisitor General has a dilemma. His dilemma is he needs him as a doctor. So if he throws him in jail, he's not gonna have his services. By now, Diogo has some political capital with some very powerful, important people, and he makes a decision to do something that he felt that would keep Diogo on the straight and narrow, but also ensure that he could still be available to be his doctor. He decides to put two priests to live in the house with Diogo and his family, to keep an eye on them, and to do essentially now they're going to be living in a fishbowl. Wherever they go, whatever they do, whatever they say will be captured by these two priests who are part of the Inquisition. And this is obviously untenable. And we've written in a wonderful scene with Diogo laying in bed with his wife, and she's saying, "What are we going to do? We can't live like this, and you have to find a way to get us out of here." And this was sort of the last straw, that they had to find a way to escape. And the question was, how was that going to happen? And you don't need to show that. So in their arrest. So let's talk a little bit about their escape to freedom. And what I did here, let's see if I've got it here. I thought I had it. Yeah, I do have it here. I thought I would play you just a little piece from the third episode of the podcast, which is a really dramatic piece. And let me set it up for you. So
Rick, before you go on,
yeah,
can you share with us where the artwork is from?
Well, this artwork, we had an artist do these for us. And a lot of the earlier artwork was artwork I found that it just fit. But we actually had an artist draw these images up to portray the story. What's interesting is, since we started working on this project, ChatGPT came out. And if you go to our website, Flames of Freedom, you will find a remarkable richness of artwork, paintings that look like they come from that era. It was all generated through AI. Which is remarkable. So we've become kind of experts at AI is hard to work with sometimes, and occasionally you get some funky, weird things happen where people end up with 6 fingers and 2 noses and 4 ears and other kinds of weird stuff. But so you can't totally depend on it. But so let me set this scene up. So one night there's a knock on the door. and there's a sailor. They live right near the docks. They live in a very probably what would we would almost say it was a palace. He was very wealthy by now. And the sailor says that his captain is sick and he understands he's a doctor. Can he come immediately? And so Diogo grabs his things together. And of course, one of the priests insists on following him to the docks. And when they get to the plank to go down on the boat, Diogo stops and looks at the priest and says, you know, what happens between me and my patients is between me and my patients, just like, you know, someone comes into your confessional. And so he basically blocks he says, I'm going nowhere. And so the priest has to wait for him on the dock, and he's with the patient for maybe half an hour, 40 minutes, comes back out, and a few nights later, it's Pentecost. This is springtime, and they arranged to have a wonderful festive meal with a number of friends and family over, and he invites the captain to come. And there's fireworks over the Bay of Lisbon. It's a glorious evening, and everyone is drinking quite liberally. Espumante, and you know the priests are there, of course, and they're getting pretty drunk as is everyone else. And at some point, the captain says, "Any of you ever been on a British galleon?" You know, and no one had. And he invites them all to come back for late night drinks in his quarters on the boat. And the priests, they turn to the priests and say, "What do you think?" And he says, "As long as we can come too." He says, "Of course." And so everybody, walks down the street. It's a few blocks away, and they all board the boat and they go down into the ship's cabin. And he's got, brandy, and they're drinking up and making toasts. And at one point, Diogo is admiring a couple Queen Anne pistols that are in a glass case. And he turns to the captain. He says, "These are handsome. What are they?" "Oh, they're Queen Anne pistols. They're ivory inset handles." And said, "Would you like to see them?" And Diogo says, "Certainly." And so he opens the case and hands the pistols to Diogo. And then Diogo turns and cocks them and points them at the captain. And that's where we pick up the piece. We'll listen for 7 or 8 minutes. And so this has to do with their escape from England. And we know this happened. We don't know all the details of what happened. We know they engineered the escape. So this is my imagination of how he might have pulled this off. Let's see here if I can play it. Boom, boom, boom. Come on, there we go.
Well then, why don't we finish the evening with a nightcap in my cabin on the ship,
My father looked to my mother, who nodded. He then looked at the 2 inquisitors, who in turn looked at each other.
I can see no harm, as long as we are invited. Well, of course you are. Well then, let me lead the way.
The captain led us out the front door and down the streets of Lisbon. It was only a few blocks' walk. Truth be told, we were all a little drunk and boisterous, including the inquisitors. When we arrived at the galleon, the captain escorted the women down the plank to the boat's deck. When we were all on board, he turned to the crew members standing guard.
Evans will be below in my cabin. Is everything secured as I ordered before leaving earlier?
Aye, aye, Captain Wingrave. Everything is just as you ordered, sir.
Good. I'll be taking my guests below. Please don't disturb me unless it's an emergency.
The sailor nodded and saluted Captain Wingrave, who returned the salute. Then he led us down a set of stairs to the rear of the boat into his spacious cabin. When we arrived, he rearranged the room to ensure the women had a place to sit. Then reached into a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of brandy, laid out small glasses on the table, and began pouring. Once the glasses were full, he passed them around to everyone.
To Senora Nunez, for one of the most impressive evenings I've ever enjoyed, on these shores or anywhere I've ever sailed.
Mi amor.
And to friendship. May ours grow for decades to come, whether I'm visiting you in your country or you're visiting me in mine.
To friendship.
To friendship.
Thank you for your kind words, Captain Wingrave. But I doubt we will be allowed to visit you in your country anytime soon. But as we all know, our God has a way of surprising us. May the day arrive when we can all travel freely across the seas.
Hear, hear, to my dear friends Diogo and Gracia for your warm hospitality, and to Captain Wingrave and his grand sailing ship,
To Captain Wingrave.
Ah, to the captain.
and to Captain Wingrave's fine brandy.
It's so good.
We drank and continued to toast each other until the captain opened another bottle of brandy. Our two inquisitors were quite inebriated, forgetting their supervisory role and joining in the convivial conversation. My father suddenly took an interest in a cabinet with glass doors, behind which were 2 flintlock pistols and 2 muskets.
My captain, those are fine armaments you have there. The inlaid ivory design on the handles is most handsome.
We call them Queen Anne pistols. Would you care to hold them?
Why, yes. I have never held a pistol before.
The captain removed the key from his vest pocket, opened the glass door, reached in, and retrieved the pistols. He then handed them to my father.
Careful now with the trigger. They're loaded.
My father marveled at the pistol's workmanship, then, suddenly, without warning, turned and pointed them at the captain, cocking them.
Watch out there, Dr. Nunez. As I said, they're loaded. Best not to point them at anyone.
And best, Captain Wingrave, that you do as I say. Direct your sailor above to give the orders to the crew to weigh anchor immediately. Unfurl the sails and depart the docks.
Dr. Nunez, certainly you jest.
No, Captain Wingrave, I am deadly serious.
Diogo, what you are doing now is punishable by death.
Father Cristiano, what your Catholic Church has done already robbed my family of its life. There's nothing more you or any of your ilk can do to keep us imprisoned.
I swear by Jesus, you and your family will burn at the stake if you continue with this insanity.
Before the night is out, I will not be in flames. But you, Father, will be swimming for your life. Lucio, come, take one of the pistols and keep it pointed at our 2 friends. If one of them so much as moves without my saying so, shoot them.
My father handed one of the pistols to Lucio, who turned and aimed at the priests. No one in the cabin moved even a finger.
As I was saying, Captain, order your ship's crew to depart immediately. I would hate to shoot you, but I will if you force my hand. You see, now I am a condemned man. My family and I have nothing to lose. As your physician, I can attest that you should have a long life ahead of you. Unless, of course, you make the wrong decision right now.
The captain sat frozen, contemplating his next move.
Very well, but you will regret this.
Captain, there are many things I regret in this life, but this is not one of them. Now, order your men to make a steadfast departure.
The captain slowly got up, went to the door, and, with deliberation, opened it.
Evans?
Aye, aye, sir.
Evans, order the crew to weigh anchor and depart from the dock immediately.
Immediately, Captain. But what about our guests?
They'll be accompanying us.
Aye, aye, Captain.
Above us, we could hear footsteps on the deck, the sails being unfurled, ropes being thrown off, and the anchor being pulled from the water. All the while, my father kept his gun pointed at the captain, and Lucio pointed his pistol at the 2 priests.
You'll never get away with this.
Father, from the rocking of the hull, I am getting away with this. And getting away from your filthy, oppressive theology. Lucio, if either of them says another word without being spoken to, shoot him.
Lucio nodded, not taking his eyes off the priests.
Captain, the moor lines have been thrown off, and we're away.
My father motioned to the captain and everyone else with his pistol.
All of us now, to the deck. Captain, I remind you, one wrong move and I will fire.
Slowly, the captain climbed the stairs with my father right behind him, the gun pointed at his back. He was followed by the two priests, with Lucio behind them. The rest of us apprehensively climbed the stairs as well. We found the crew standing aside nervously, watching my father with his gun fixed on the captain. Lucio had the two priests in the sights of his pistol.
Fathers, you have a choice. You can swim back to the dock now, or wait until we reach the English Channel. I suggest you choose the former option if you value your life.
You and your family will burn in hell for this!
Father, I expect you'll be there to greet us when we arrive. Now, up on the gunwale and jump.
The two priests nervously dragged themselves onto the gunwale, holding ropes strung to the mast to steady themselves as they stood erect, looking out at the quickly receding dock.
What are you waiting for, fathers? Your Messiah?
My father placed his gun into the back of Father Cristiano, who quickly jumped into the murky water. He then did the same to Father Gualberto.
I am not such a good swimmer.
No better time to learn.
He shoved him, and he tumbled into the bay, cursing. The two priests arduously began swimming back.
Now, Captain Wingrave, I believe you and I have some business to conclude.
So that's a little piece. I'll give you a little preview. The captain was in on it all along. And it was all well acted out. And he goes down below the deck and hands the guns to the captain, and the captain tells him that actually they were not loaded. He said, I couldn't take a chance. So, and he pays him the additional money that they had agreed upon when they met in the boat. And so they get their passage to England. And so the story, yeah, there we go. So they arrive in London in 1726, and they end up going to Bevis Marks Synagogue, which was the Sephardic synagogue. There actually turned out there was an Ashkenazi synagogue that was only a mile or two away from Bevis Marks, but they know of Bevis Marks, and they arrive at Bevis Marks, and they walk in. They've never been in a synagogue before. They don't know what to expect. They're expecting iconography. There's no Jesus hanging. There's none of that there. And it's all new to them. And there's a point where his daughter is about ready to go and open the door to the ark because she's curious what's behind it. And the rabbi comes in and says, "Stop!" God forbid that a girl would be touching the Torah. And so there's an interesting kind of presaging of what happens here is that Gracia goes to shake the hand of the rabbi, and the rabbi won't shake her hand. And he explains it's their custom. And this is the beginning for Gracia to suddenly realize that her expectations about and fantasies about what Judaism would be or could be are very different than actually what they encounter. And she starts to discover that she as a woman really does not have a place there. They have a balcony where the women have to sit, and there are a number of events that happen that really disenchant her. The other thing that happens for them is that they're now refugees, and here they are. He was at the top of his game in Lisbon. He was a respected doctor. He starts going around to visit with other doctors who, for whatever reason, and he's in his 60s now. He's not a young man any longer. He can't find a place to practice. So he ends up opening a practice actually out of his house and actually tending to other refugees coming in from Europe and who have nothing to pay. So, and his sons can't find work. During this time, James Oglethorpe is developing a reputation as a reformer of the English debtor prisons. And in England, if you owed somebody some money, they could have you thrown into prison until you could repay. And the prisons were really remarkable places because you had to pay for your own food. You had to bribe the jailers to be sure you had a decent room. And it went on and on and on. And they actually imported instruments of torture from Portugal. So they were horrific places. And Oglethorpe had a friend who was a famous architect, young man, who owed somebody £5. He's thrown into the prison in London, and he has nothing to bribe people, and he tries to write letters to let people know that who he knows, and they're sent out. But he's thrown into a cell with 40 other men. That cell's probably made for 4 or 5 men, and they all have they all not chicken pox. They have not chicken pox, but whatever the major disease was. What was the major disease then, Dan?
Smallpox.
Smallpox. Thank you. Smallpox. Thank you. And so by the time Oglethorpe comes, he gets a letter that he's in prison. He comes to bail him out. He's died, and Oglethorpe is incensed, and so he leads a reform movement in Parliament to change the laws. But he becomes somebody who becomes a real proponent of helping the poor. And so he, along with someone else who was very well-established Englishman, decided that they want to create a new colony where they can bring the poor. It was very idealistic. They wanted to be able to bring the poor in England over to the new colony, give them land so they could farm their own land. He also didn't believe in slavery. So there would be no slaves in this new colony in Georgia. And they go about convincing Parliament and also the king to accept this idea. And so in late 1732, in November 1732, Oglethorpe departs with about 120 people, settlers. It turns out most of them are actually handpicked for their skills because they realize they need carpenters and people who know how to grow things, and they have great kind of aspirations that they're going to start silkworm farming, and they're going to plant trees and grow silkworms, and they have the belief that they're going to be able to create vineyards in this new colony of Georgia that will rival the grapes of France. So many of the things economically didn't work out, and so there were 3 very, very wealthy Jews who had commissions to raise money for the colony, and they were raising money and contributing money to the colony until the trustees discover that their intention was actually to send Jews over. And it turns out there was a phenomena happening both in England, but this was happening also in Amsterdam and in some other large area communities that had Jews. Is that the wealthy didn't know what to do with all these very, very poor Jews. And so they began paying to ship them off to the Caribbean. And so that's how Jews ended up in the Caribbean. And unfortunately, many Jews, men, abandoned their families. So it really contradicts our notion of a good Jewish father and husband, is that many Jewish men abandoned their families and came to the Caribbean to find look for their fortune. And so this ploy by these wealthy Jews decide that they're going to get their own boat and send the Jews over. And if Oglethorpe won't let them stay, and they'll arrange to have them sent on to the Bahamas or somewhere else. And so in some ways they were shipping this problem of charity, having to support these charities out of England. So it was a two-edged sword. So they rent a boat called the William and Sarah, and the boat departs in early 1733, and it turns out that Diogo and Gracia does not come with Diogo initially. One of her daughters is pregnant and decides she wants to stay in England, and the mother decides to stay behind. And so Diogo and Gracia they depart, not knowing whether they'll ever see each other again. And the journey over to America turns out to be horrific. The boat nearly crashes, in the English Channel in terrible storms, and it has to be repaired. Every one of these boats had to have a carpenter on board, and they would always carry 3 or 4 spare masts because they would often be broken in storms, and they would have to, patch up the boat along the way and keep it floating. And when they got to America, they were just off of the coast of North Carolina, and they ran into terrible storms and they almost crashed. And they had to actually kind of go into the inlet there, the inner waters there, for about a month and a half to repair the boat before they could go south to Georgia. But the boat shows up. Oglethorpe arrives in Port Royal, South Carolina, in January, and they go on an expedition, and they find what is now Savannah. It seems to be a good place. It's defendable. It's got, it's on a bluff, and in the meantime, the Jews are having this horrific trip over, and one of the babies dies on the trip, and they have to actually bury the child at sea, which is a really heartrending story. And then when he arrives in Yamacraw Bluff, obviously the Creek Indians are there, but he befriends the Creek Indians, and he meets Chief Tomochichi, who he actually ends up taking back to England to meet the Queen at one point. And there's a woman named Mary Musgrove, who's half Indian, half English, who becomes his interpreter. And then the Jews arrive in July 1733, and Oglethorpe is like nonplussed. Who are you, and what are you doing here? And at first, but he discovers that Diogo's a doctor, and there's an epidemic that's been raging in the colony. And the doctor who had come over with him had died from the epidemic. About 20 other people had died, and half the colony had a high fever and were at threat of dying. And so when Oglethorpe is shaken by this and realizes there's this doctor, and he initially says that to Diogo, you can stay, you and your family, but the rest of the Jews will have to find another port of call. And Diogo gives an impassioned speech that basically tells all the things he's been through, and says it's either all of us or none of us. And Oglethorpe decides to let them stay. He ends up going to Charlestown. It was known as Charlestown at that time, to confer with an attorney to show him the trust documents, to be sure that he was on solid legal ground. There was the trust documents, so there could be no Catholics in the new colony, because they were fearful the Catholics, if the Spanish invaded, that they would maybe have mixed allegiances, and no slavery. And they also enforced no rum, because they was afraid that this was going to impede people, that they wouldn't want to work hard. But he gave the Jews full rights, gave them land, and they became integral to the community. And that's a drawing that early drawing of the settlement. And you'll notice that actually Oglethorpe actually laid out the settlement in blocks and squares. And if you go to Savannah today, that is the design that Oglethorpe created, probably on a sheet of paper, and it was based on things he had seen in Europe, and became obviously a key piece. And then in 1741, actually Oglethorpe decided he was going to try to take St. Augustine, and he went down to try to take it. And if you've ever been to St. Augustine, the fort's walls must be 10 feet thick, and he failed, and it pissed off the Spanish. And the Spanish and the English were at war. There was a lot of things going on with the Spanish and English, and word comes that they're mounting an armada of ships, 35 ships, maybe close to 3,500 armed men, to come and invade Georgia. The Jews hear about this, especially the Sephardic Jews. They don't want to be there when the Spanish show up, because they're fearful of being rearrested and tried for heresy by the Inquisition. And so most of them, with the exception of one, they depart and leave. Some come back, but some never return. And among those who left was Diogo, who became Samuel when he went to England and reverted to Judaism, and his wife Gracia became Rebecca. They left, and it's not clear whether they died, where they died, whether it was in Charlestown. Their daughter married a man named David Machado, who became the Hazan at the synagogue in New York, and ended up moving there, and they had 2 daughters. And then he died very young, and she remarried, and she lived into past the American Revolution. So in our story, she actually becomes the narrator, and she's telling the story to her grandson, who's just become bar mitzvah. So that's the story. The Spanish are coming in, and they flee, and they invade St. Simon's Island in 1742, and they have 3,500 men. And Oglethorpe has about 200 men and some Indians who are his allies. They know St. Simon's Island like the back of their hand, and it's very swampy. And they end up massacring ambushing the Spanish. And the Spanish are also fearful of the weather, fearful of hurricanes. And at some point, they get cold feet and they withdraw, never to come back again. And what happens is that Oglethorpe, he feels emboldened. He decides he's going to make one last attempt to take St. Augustine. And he takes a troop of soldiers down there and fails again. He's accused by some of his soldiers of malfeasance and treason, and he has to depart in 1743. I'm going to sneeze. Hold on a second. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Yeah, thank you. And goes back to England essentially to defend his life, but he's exonerated, and he never returns again to Savannah. And he goes on to live a pretty long life and becomes a strong proponent of anti-slavery, and became in some ways a really important voice against the slavery movement. So that, my friends, is it. I'm going to stop sharing here and see what questions you've got. So just a couple things about the show and the production. So one of the things we did in producing the show is that we had a cast of actors, an ensemble cast, and it was about 7 or 8 actors really, a few who were the key ones, and we have one in Hungary, a couple in Los Angeles, one in Mexico City, a few here locally in Atlanta. Everyone's recorded individually, and then it was all pieced back together. And we have a wonderful sound engineer who did all the original sound design and all the sound effects and everything that was layered in. So in some cases, some of the actors played multiple roles. And so actually in the show, they're actually talking to themselves. You don't know that, but so that was a remarkable piece in the development of that. And we're working right now on the second season, which is what happens in the colony after the Jews arrive. And there's some really interesting pieces of the story to that go, between 1733 and 1741. But Jews, the descendants of Diogo, and then there were I think there were 31 Sephardic Jews and about 8 Ashkenazi Jews on the original boat. Some of their descendants have gone on to play pivotal roles in this country. One of them ended up owning Thomas Jefferson's estate in Monticello and actually rehabbed it. It was in terrible condition. So there's really some interesting storylines that flow out of this story. But they go on to play a really important role in Savannah, in the American Revolution, and obviously the history of Georgia. So I will stop right there. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like we've been on a journey.
Well, yeah, you just went through hundreds of years of history. Yeah, Dan.
So remind me, maybe you said this at the beginning, how and why did you latch on to this particular story, Savannah, Portugal and everything, as opposed to any other town or story?
Sure. So Lance Tolan, who's the executive producer for the show, Lance did not grow up Jewish, and he was orphaned as a very young person, ended up being raised by a grandmother. And it turns out that he discovered all of his friends. He grew up in Griffin, Georgia, which is south of Atlanta. Many of his friends were Jewish. And it turns out he discovered that he had really Jewish roots, that going back maternally on his maternal side. And so he reverted to Judaism, and he came across that monument that I showed you at the very beginning, back in the late 1980s. And something about that stuck with him. And he was fascinated by this whole story and began, he actually wanted, he had done a documentary a few years ago before COVID on Brunswick, Georgia, which is during World War II. Brunswick became a huge center for constructing, building boats because the Nazis were sinking a boat every week, and they had to produce a lot of boats quickly. And like 75,000 people descended on Brunswick. There's a boat building yard there, and they were knocking these boats out. They knew they didn't have to last long. They didn't have to be, forever, for transporting food, troops, and whatever. And he was fascinated by that. And then there was in the naval base, they built huge hangars for blimps that were going up and down the coast to try to spot submarines, and then they would call in planes with depth charges and stuff. And most of the survivors of that, people who know those stories, were either dead or they were gone, or at least their children were still around. And they had memories. So he did a documentary for Georgia Public Television, and it was reasonably well done. It wasn't world class or anything. And so he thought he would do a documentary on this story. And he kind of lost his way. He hired a film crew, and he was shooting film at the Mikveh Israel, the synagogue. If you've ever been to the synagogue in Savannah, it looks like a church out of Europe somewhere. It's the architecture is not anything you would ever expect. And he went to Bevis Marks and interviewed people in Bevis Marks, the rabbi in Bevis Marks in London, the synagogue there. And he kind of lost his way. And so somebody introduced him to an entertainment law attorney here in Atlanta. And he said, I need help with this story. And he says, well, I've got somebody I know, and it's a guy named Mark Simon, who's my partner. And Mark and I have been trying to find a project to work on together. And Mark called me and said, I've got something. And so Lance is underwritten. We first wrote it the first script was 2.5 hours. And it was going to be like a 2.5 hour, feature-length film for like Netflix. And it had a lot of weaknesses. And so I went back and rewrote it as 4 1-hour episodes to really help develop the story. And at some point, we were still knocking on doors and trying to find our way into Hollywood. It's a hard sell. And right now, it's a really hard sell. And there it is. Gothic. Yeah, look at that. It doesn't look like a synagogue. And so we started. So we decided at some point. I said, guys, we could take these, and it actually turned out that the 4 1-hour episodes, I found points within each of those. I could break them into 3 20-minute or so episodes for a podcast. And it worked out with a little rework and writing, and so we ended up developing the season had 12 episodes in it. So we're starting fresh now in season 2. I'm writing it as podcast episodes, as opposed to trying to retrofit something from the TV, like a TV script. So
Wow, thank you.
yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah. So if you go to flamesoffreedom.net, you can listen to it there. You can get it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. You can listen to it. Someone else had a question. I thought someone raised a hand. Yeah, Devorah.
It's actually not a question. I just looked up that synagogue. I've been in that synagogue.
Oh, cool.
When I did a trip at one point down, I don't know, it was a driving trip anyway. And I was in Savannah and looked for a synagogue. And I was looking online at the picture. I actually sat in there and spoke to people, and I was there a couple of times.
It's the third oldest synagogue in America. Elizabeth, we went down for the 290th anniversary, and it reminded what Elizabeth's comment was. Oh, it's what Reb Zalman would say: freeze-dried Judaism.
I've attended high holiday services there long ago because I lived in a small town called St. Mary's, which is south of Savannah on the Georgia coast.
Yeah. So their rabbi, the current rabbi, Rabbi Haas, he's a really nice guy. He's actually a stand-up comic. He did stand-up comedy. And Mark, you would love this guy. Yeah.
Any other questions before we let Rick go?
Thank you for sitting through all of that.
Thank you so much. And something I said to you, Rick, before we came on that you all might not know is that we tend to get twice as many people, at least, who watch the videos on our YouTube channel. So the fact that there were, quote unquote, only 11 of us here this evening definitely does not mean that only 11 people will have benefited from Rick's wonderful presentation. So thank you so much again, Rick. And we all look forward, well, many of us look forward to giving you a big hug.
My cat was here for half the presentation. That counts for something.
That counts for a lot in our book.
So a couple of coming attractions. First of all, next Wednesday night, we're not meeting. Renee and I will already be at the Claggett Center preparing for the retreat. But the following Wednesday night, which is the first Wednesday in March, and all 4 Wednesday nights in March, Rabbi Deb Kolodny will be teaching on Judaism and gender. And I know it's going to be really, really interesting and touching upon a lot of important subjects that you might have been wondering about. What else? The other thing I want to mention is tomorrow, or it's already tomorrow in Israel, it's going to be a very, very hard day. At 6 o'clock tomorrow, we will be gathering, as always, for our prayerful gathering. And so I want to invite you all to join us at 6 o'clock tomorrow. What we've all been finding in these gatherings is that we're there for each other, and it's an opportunity to really hold each other and feel like we're being held at the same time in community. And then, of course, Shabbos is right around the corner, and I'll see hopefully everybody there as well. So I'm going to stop the recording right here.